This is the Transforming Anxiety Podcast with Kelly Hanlon McCormick, and today is episode number 187, The Two Kinds of Suffering. Welcome to Transforming Anxiety. I'm your host, Kelly McCormick. I'm a mom to two boys, a wife, friend, daughter, and sister, and I'm a certified life coach, yoga teacher, and soon-to-be mindfulness meditation teacher. I'm no stranger to anxiety, and I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and your emotions so that you too can transform anxiety into calm, peace, and whatever you want for your life. I'm so glad you're here. Hey there. Welcome in today. It's podcast time. So good to be here hanging out with you. I so love spending this time with you. I love having these conversations, taking some time and consideration for these kinds of teachings, these concepts. It's important. I know we tend to get stuck in the weeds of our lives, right? Just like plowing through our to-do lists and getting stuff done. But this work, I tell you, it's not a luxury. It's not a nice to have kind of thing. This stuff is kind of sort of mandatory, right? Showing up, practicing, staying aware and kind and compassionate with ourselves. This is, I think, the most important work we can do. Things really kind of start falling into place when this stuff comes first. It's been my experience anyway. All right. Listen, today we're talking about the two kinds of suffering. There's the suffering that leads to more suffering. I know you know what I mean when I say this. We suffer, and the only thing that kind of suffering brings is more of the same, more suffering. And then there's the kind of suffering that leads to freedom. Have you considered this? That sometimes when we're in pain, when we struggle, when we're gobsmacked by challenge, that suffering is the portal to liberation. Yeah? So we're going to talk about that too. So first, let's take a look at the suffering that leads to more suffering and how this shows up. In fact, we're going to go through some examples of suffering that leads to more suffering. This will help illustrate what I mean. So one way we do this is through idle complaining. Like when you start down the path of complaining, maybe it's about work or your partner or the weather. When you're complaining, and especially if it's something you complain about often, meaning you aren't venting because it's brand new or it just happened and you're trying to process something in real time. Well, like when you're truly complaining and telling an old story over and over again, you create more suffering for yourself from that suffering. Complaining, oh my goodness, there is no upside to complaining. Complaining is telling an icky story too many times. Complaining is awful. Complaining is different than, let's say something hard or weird or confusing happens. It's a new circumstance, something in real time, and you're trying to figure it out. And so maybe you call up your friend or your mom or you talk to your partner about it. When it's fresh and you're feeling newly, just gobsmacked by something, connecting and talking it through can be very cathartic. That's not complaining. That's processing. You'll know you've flipped over into complaining when you've said it more than a couple times. When it's a way of life, when it's something that's ongoing, then you're complaining. And whatever you're complaining about is creating some suffering, right? That thing that happened, that trigger point, you don't like it. Maybe you're making it mean something. It's probably less than ideal for you. So you're already suffering. But I promise you this, complaining about it, that's a recipe for more suffering. You're suffering through your job. You're suffering through a struggle with your kids. Maybe you're suffering through an injury or an illness. That's painful. Being with that pain, being with it, that's one thing. But complaining about it and creating more pain, this is suffering plus suffering. Why do this? Right? In The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho wrote, "Tell your heart that the fear of suffering is worse than the suffering itself." Like, we don't need to complain about the suffering. And complaining may be a way of resisting the fear of suffering. Right? Tell your fear that the fear of suffering is worse than the suffering itself. We don't need to complain about it. We can suffer, we can feel the pain, and we can move through it. No complaining required. All right. Another way that we create suffering through suffering is by repeating old patterns, staying stuck in old habits that aren't serving us anymore, if they ever did. I know you know this, you've experienced this, right? Maybe you're currently experiencing this. You watch yourself doing or saying something that you know doesn't work for you. You know there's no value, that it's not taking you closer to who you want to be or what you want to achieve or how you want to feel. And yet, you just keep doing it. You keep spending hours on social media. You keep drinking every night. You keep saying yes to every volunteer opportunity that comes to you through the school. You keep hoping for change or wanting to start that new habit, and yet never seems to quite work out for you. Now, this is one of those things that's simple, but it's not always easy. But I invite you to not get too hung up on the idea that it's not easy, quote unquote. Don't let that stop you. Like, who cares? You can do hard things. You do hard things regularly. I know you do. You can break out of old patterns. You can wake up in the moment you're about to hit rewind and play the pattern again and see what you're doing. You can get aware there. Thich Nhat Hanh said, "People have a hard time letting go of their suffering. Out of a fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar." And this is important when we consider patterns and habits. What are you doing out of familiarity? What do you fear about change, about doing something different, about the unknown? And is that keeping you in this loop? Are you suffering more than you need to? People have a hard time letting go of their suffering. Out of a fear of the unknown, they prefer suffering that is familiar. One more note on this. I've seen this happen when we really grab onto a story or an identity for ourselves. When we really start to believe a certain thing about ourselves. Like, maybe you believe that you struggle with your weight. Maybe you believe that you're not good with money. Maybe you believe that you're impatient, or that you're always late, or that you're anxious. Maybe you say these things just like you say, the sky is blue. When you hold on to those ideas like truths, you're holding on to your suffering. Like, there's an unknown there for sure. What if you lost the weight and you weren't someone who ever thought about food or the number on the scale or how your body looked? What if your bank account felt solid and secure and safe and you didn't ever struggle with money and saving in debt? It's unknown, right? It's hard to picture, especially if you've always firmly believed the opposite. Maybe you come from a family or a community that believes the opposite. Are you holding on to suffering because the fear of the unknown is so familiar that it's become preferable? Like, this is suffering leading to more suffering. All right, so let's talk about the kind of suffering that leads to freedom. All right? Charles Dickens wrote in Great Expectations, "Suffering has been stronger than all other teachings and has taught me to understand what your heart used to be. I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape." Man, I love Dickens. It always takes me like 50 pages to get into the cadence of his writing when I start one of his books, like that old English. Oh, but it's worth it every time. So he said, "I have been bent and broken, but I hope into a better shape." Yeah. One kind of suffering that leads to freedom is when you hit some sort of rock bottom. Let's say you lose a job. Maybe you lose a loved one. Maybe you get dumped. Maybe you find yourself on the bathroom floor one too many times. Someone you care about deeply looks at you right in the eyes and says, "What are you doing?" And you're at a rock bottom. That's some suffering right there. None of that's good. But, what happens next? You ask a question like that. Now what? Now what? And if you're aware and you can pay attention, if you have the capacity to listen in, you can find freedom. You can kick off from there. I'm starting to think that like nothing is complete without a quote from John Green. So here we go. He wrote this in his book, Looking for Alaska. He said, "The Buddha said that suffering was caused by desire, we learned, and that the cessation of desire meant the cessation of suffering. When you stopped wishing things wouldn't fall apart, you'd stop suffering when they did." Yeah. So this quote, I thought, worked nicely with this concept. Things fall apart. We hit rock bottom. Then things come together. Then they fall apart again. Things have a way of coming together and falling apart and coming together and falling apart. I know you've noticed. When we stop wishing things wouldn't fall apart, we stop suffering when they do. All right, the next way that suffering can lead to freedom is the suffering of discomfort. Now listen, discomfort isn't great, right? By definition, it is uncomfortable. But the suffering of discomfort can lead you somewhere. So something I say most days, actually, I definitely say this every week to students, is that the price you pay for change is discomfort. Like when you go to the coffee shop to buy a coffee, you pay in dollars, right? That's what we've agreed is the currency for most goods and services in modern day times. We use money, right? When you're looking to create change, when you want to grow and improve and learn and change yourself, you're going to pay in discomfort. Like you have to pay $7 for coffee. You might have to pay 23 discomforts to make a habit of getting to bed earlier. Maybe you have to pay 117 discomforts to cultivate more patience with your kids. Or like 4,679 discomforts to change your relationship with alcohol. But before you start thinking that's a steep price in discomfort, let me offer you this. It's uncomfortable either way. All right? It's uncomfortable to lose your patience with your kids. And it's uncomfortable to practice being more patient. It's uncomfortable to drink if you want to stop drinking. And it's uncomfortable to stop drinking. I say this because there is no magical third door where you get to be totally comfortable. And that's okay. In fact, it means you might as well choose the discomfort that leads you where you want to go. Which is why I say the suffering of discomfort can lead straight to freedom. You see? All right, lastly, the suffering of doing it anxious. So I use a little litmus test to see what's what with this one, doing it anxious. And that is the question, is it limiting or is it expansive? Like, here's an example. I've talked to a lot of clients over the years who struggle with things like driving, traveling, being in crowds, riding the rides at amusement parks, going to concerts, right? You get it. And I always push them on it. I say, okay, great. Guess what? You never have to ride another roller coaster. You never have to get on another airplane. You never have to get behind the wheel of a car again. Never. You never have to do it again. And for them, this will either be enormously freeing or actually pretty much every single time they kind of freeze and they're like, wait, what? But I want to drive or fly or go to a concert. So if I tell you that you never have to go to the moon, you never have to do heroin, you never have to single-handedly sort out foreign policy for the world, like, you're probably relieved, right? Like, that feels expansive. It's like, oh, phew, the freedom. Thank goodness I'm free of that. But if that same freedom doesn't arise in your body, when I offer you a permanent out of whatever it is you think causes so much anxiety in you, well, then we know you want that thing. You want that possibility. You want to explore doing it anxious. So have you ever heard someone describe someone as fearless? Like our fearless leader? Or like that kid is totally fearless? It all sounds really tough and sexy, but really think about that. Fearless is not a good thing. Fearless would be, it would be like pathological, right? Fear keeps you buckling your seatbelt. Fear makes sure that you don't eat moldy food. Fear keeps you from jumping off cliffs or walking into the street without looking both ways. Fear keeps you safe. As long as it's in check, right? Fear is a good thing. And anxiety has some of these same properties. Anxiety can slow you down when something seems new or confusing or challenging. Anxiety can signal that there's something uncertain up ahead. Anxiety can highlight a trigger or a shift for you, and you can use that information, and you can do it anxious. Like, listen, it's not fun or easy to do things when you're feeling scared or anxious. Sure, totally. But it's possible. Like, I've climbed mountains. I have watched horror movies. I have ridden roller coasters. I have traveled internationally. I have given birth. I have done a lot of things that scared me, that brought about some amount of anxiety. And it's not that I wasn't not scared or anxious when I did them. I just did them scared and anxious because I wanted to do them, right? I didn't have to do any of those things. And I don't have to do any of those things ever again if I don't want to. But it turns out there are things I am scared of that I want to do. There are things that make me feel anxious that I want to do. So I will do them anxious. So this is the suffering of doing it anxious. It's not necessarily fun. That's not what we're here for, right? But it's worth it. It's not easy. It can be simple. It's certainly not comfortable, but it's usually pretty freaking amazing. Do it anxious. Yeah? That kind of suffering is so freeing. I can feel anxious and do the things I want to do in life. Like, wild, right? It's a feeling. I can feel something and still take action. We humans are pretty cool, I'm telling you. Viktor Frankl wrote this in Man's Search for Meaning. He said, in some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. And I just thought that was a good way to close out for today. Okay, my friend, that's it for this one. The two kinds of suffering. The suffering that leads to more suffering, and the suffering that leads to freedom. If you find yourself in pain, if you find yourself suffering, ask what the end game is. Are you creating more suffering with your suffering? Or is it the kind of suffering that will liberate you? This is a powerful question. It's a good one to keep handy. All right. Please don't forget to rate and review the show. I will see you at the same time, same place next week for more Transforming Anxiety. And until then, please take care. Do you have someone to help you with your stress, anxiety, worry, and overwhelm? If not, I would love to be your coach. The Fierce Calm Project is my virtual coaching program where we get to go in on topics like this one, and I can help you apply these lessons to your life so that you're creating your own transformation. We do live coaching calls, guided meditations, on-demand yoga classes. We hold book club where we read books your neighborhood book club won't, and there's lots of bonus content that I've created just for you. When you're ready to take what you're learning on the podcast to a whole other level, then come on over and check out the Fierce Calm Project at kellyhanlonmccormick.com/Fierce Calm Project.